Ladies and gentlemen, you are now entering the Decent Christian Talk podcast. Enjoy.
Decent Christian Talk, episode 110. What's up, everybody? I'm Gabe Jones.
I am Josiah Jones.
We are a show by the fans.
For the fans.
And we are back with the Newsboys today. Today we're going to be talking about the Newsboys of the 2000s. That's 2000 to 2009. If you missed our last episode, we talked about the 90s Newsboys. Today we're going to be continuing that discussion with the 2000s Newsboys. And I'm excited.
Yeah, this is maybe not as exciting to me as the 90s Newsboys.
No, way to start it off.
I'm just setting up everyone's expectations that this might be a letdown episode for me. So don't expect Gabe is going to have to carry this episode.
All right. Well, something you will want to check out is our bonus episode on Patreon. If you haven't heard, we will be talking about the Newsboys' Take Me to Your Leader album. It is the album, not to play spoiler, but we ranked it fairly high on our last episode.
Yeah, go back and listen.
So we will be talking about that more in depth. We will be going track by track. If you want to check that out, go to patreon.com/Decent Christian Talk. For as low as $1 a month, you can help us out, fund our show. Thank you so much for everybody that helps. We love you all. And thank you to 13 Palm Tree Studios.
We are here, and everything is clean and wiped down.
Yes. And we are socially distancing over 6 feet apart. Well, maybe close to it.
Yes.
All right. So, 2000s Newsboys. If you haven't listened to our setup of where the Newsboys came from, where they went to, what happened to them through the 90s, you need to push pause and go listen to our last episode, because we're just going to pick up where we left off. And that is...
Where did we leave off?
After the album of Love Liberty Disco. They decided to tour with an airdome. We're hitting the 2000s because Love Liberty Disco came out at the very end of 1999. And in the spring of 2000, they decide, hey, we're done playing in buildings. Buildings are too cool. They're not cool enough. They're so last year. So let's bring our own buildings.
People ridicule this, and I've even heard the Newsboys ridicule this in hindsight. But the concept of this is not necessarily an awful one. What they did was, of course, we've talked about on our last episode, they had drum stunts, they had a spaceship, they had motorcycles and all this different stuff. And this tour, they thought, what if we have a blow-up dome? And if you ever went into, is it called a planetarium?
Kind of, yeah.
As a kid. So their concept was, we can kind of black out the sky. We can put everyone in this dome. We can have a cool light show on the ceiling. And if we're playing in the daytime, it can give us shade. If we're playing at night, if we're playing in the weather, whatever the case may be, we're going to do an outdoors tour and just inflate our own dome. Did that cause any issues?
Consequently, easy for me to say.
Yeah, consequently,
the spring of 2000 happened to be like the windiest spring in the history of mankind.
Was that El Nino?
Something like that. At least that's at least what they thought anyway.
The dome blew away.
It blew over quite a bit.
Yeah, and that's the problem when you have thousands of people inside.
So they ended up having to have some of these in like some local places where they just set up outside and did a show. And I don't know. It probably wasn't their best idea in hindsight. They toured with Sonic Flood and another band from Australia called Beanbag, who was actually the very first band, I believe, on Peter Furler and Wes Campbell's new record label, In Pop Records. which was kind of a new venture for them as well.
And I remember Beanbag being on Carmen's movie, Heart of a Champion.
Oh, I don't remember that.
I remember it specifically because they were listening to Beanbag, and the mom came in and was like, "You're listening to this garbage?"
I thought it was KJ52.
I thought it was Beanbag.
You might be right.
Where, whatever the case was, it was a Christian movie, so they didn't want to have some vulgar or whatever music on there. So they just put kind of a rock sounding. How would you describe Beanbag? It's.
Oh man, Brendan's gonna kill me for this, but it sounds a lot like early 21 Pilots a little bit.
Okay, but yeah, they had a different sound,
and I just mean that from like they rap and they have some grungy, sound.
It's almost a preamble to
a very raw and very grungy 21 Pilots.
Okay. So, but yeah, I just remember that being in that movie, and instead of getting some kind of non-family friendly music, they used Beanbag as their troubled kid was listening to the music. But
I remember seeing them live on this tour, and the stop that I had was not an airdome stop. This was we're just going to have to set up in a church nearby stop. And I remember seeing them live and just being so blown away that as soon as they stopped playing, I went to their table and bought their album.
I do not remember much about Beanbag. I remember you being a big fan.
Yeah.
But that's about as much as I remember of them.
So yeah, Sonic Flood and Beanbag.
What is Sonic Flood famous for?
Sonic Flood is famous for doing they tried to be like the American Delirious. Well, first of all, Sonic Flood was zilch to begin with, and which was pretty much DC Talk's band. And then most of them left and evolved into a worship band called Sonic Flood. They're not really, they have an origin story from zilch, but they're not the same band either.
What I was referring to is I Could Sing of Your Love Forever, which everybody knows that song.
Yeah, but Delirious sang that one.
Did they write that song?
Yes.
Well, shoot.
Sonic Flood covered it.
But Sonic Flood that's probably their most famous thing.
Yeah, that and like, I Want to Know You, I Want to Hear Your Voice.
Yeah, that song as well.
Yeah. Anyway, I don't know if that had some impact on where the Newsboys were headed creatively over this decade, touring with Sonic Flood. I don't know. We'll see. We'll talk about it. So they release a hits album in the year 2000, October 24th. After they're all done with the airdome, they settle down, they record a couple songs, a couple new songs like Joy, Who, and Praises. They do a remix of God Is Not a Secret with Toby Mac. That is one of their hardest songs they've ever come out with.
One of my favorite songs, to be honest, in retrospect.
Yeah, so...
and the mega mix that they had at the end of the album.
Cool, yeah.
Where they just, it's a long, long song, and they kind of sing the choruses, Shine, and all their Entertaining Angels, a bunch of different stuff.
So they, so after that, they released an album called Thrive.
Which was kind of good news because normally, if a band is releasing a hits album, it's not good news for the longevity of the band. It's normally here's our goodbye. And
well, to be fair, DC Talk had just released Intermission, or around that time they did. Audio Adrenaline released Hit Parade, and it was, at least for Audio Adrenaline and Newsboys, this was kind of like, they started both going into a more direction of more contemporary music, I guess.
Yeah.
Some would say even like worship, at least with the Newsboys, that's probably true. Thrive came out, and Steve Taylor is back.
He's back.
For those of you that weren't paying attention on the last episode, he was not on Love Liberty Disco at all. But he is a big part of the songwriting on this album, and I really like this album. And this is an album that there's a lot of these albums in this decade that I just didn't really remember that well. And it was really helpful to go back and listen to. I remember the music video for Million Pieces and me getting so tired of that song that I ended up not liking it for a while. But when I listened to it recently, I was like, that's a really good song.
I just remember the production of that music video, and there was a parade and there were floats and all kinds of different stuff. Now, I haven't seen it in probably 20 years. And if I went back and looked at the graphics in it, I'd probably laugh. But I just remember that video kind of standing out from what other people were doing.
Yeah. And there was, there's a fun little fact on Fat of the Land, which is track number 8 on this album. There's some subtle background vocals by a guy named Michael Tate.
Interesting.
Yes.
So this is his first Newsboys song.
Yeah. So, alongside this, and we'll get a little bit more into this soon. I should mention this band lineup is the same as the last few albums. Peter Furler, Phil Joel, Jody Davis, Jeff Frankenstein, Duncan Phillips. They released a fun little long-form music video that they recorded at the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame with this album. And so that's kind of fun. Have you seen that before?
I have not, but that brings to mind something that we may have left off our last episode.
What's that?
Newsboys Down Under the Big Top.
Well, I mean, that's going to be on our bonus episode, dude.
Okay, so are we teasing the bonus episode right here?
Yeah.
Hey, we're going to talk about Newsboys Down Under the Big Top on our bonus episode.
Yes. So this album, there was some like step up to the microphone vibes on this, kind of the same vibes, but there was also an indication of where they were going to be headed with a song called Lord, I Don't Know, and especially a song called It Is You. These songs were very worshipful, and It Is You was a big, big track for the band.
I know we mentioned in the last episode how big Shine was.
Yeah.
It Is You is probably their song of this decade.
Yeah, it's up there for sure. And it's kind of like, I kind of attribute to when Third Day wrote like Your Love, O Lord, which they didn't write it. It comes right from the Psalms, but I understand what you mean. Yeah. So, and they kind of went off and did worship after that. It Is You was such a big track for adult contemporary radio, which now you would just call K-Love pretty much.
Yeah.
That they, and you know what, that was also, it was becoming, Delirious was big at that time. Sonic Flood, like we mentioned before, was big. There was a lot of bands. Third Day, like we mentioned, Michael W. Smith, a lot of these bands, even bands like Skillet and The Insiders, and a lot of these bands were putting out worship albums, and that was just kind of like the thing to do. Not permanently. They were just like, well, we've got to have a worship album.
Well, it also, speaking from the business side of things, it became the thing to do because bands like Delirious were doing very well as far as sales and money and profit. And so, it's an unfortunate thing. Some of these worship albums are some of the best albums of all time, but then also at the same time, some of these worship albums may have been forced, I don't know if necessarily by the record label or whatever the case is, but if you look at music today, I wouldn't say this is where it kind of started to go off the rails, but worship music just isn't the same as it was at this point. Now you find some diamonds in the rough like David Crowder or someone like that, but this is don't necessarily know where I'm going to go with that.
I don't know if it was because it was kind of fresh at the time. You know, growing up in churches, it was really refreshing to hear the Newsboys do
being played
worship music.
Yeah, and being played
like with the style that I genuinely liked a lot better than hymns or whatever.
Yeah, so it like I mentioned, some of these albums that were put out, like Delirious, even the Newsboys here, seemed very genuine instead of a business decision, which I feel like some people did in the future. But
right,
I mean, we could argue that for a while, but yeah, that's just something I felt like needed to be mentioned as far as the landscape of the rest of Christian music.
So, where we're headed with that is the Newsboys. I think not long after Thrive, they did some festivals. Like they had like a festival Con Dios that they toured with Audio Adrenaline during this time, and other bands. But not long after that, in 2003,
I wanted to mention one more thing before we moved on from this album. One of the stage stunts, I guess you could call it, that they did was, I remember they had kind of a rotating set.
Yeah.
Where Peter Furler, I'm sure, was dizzy. I don't know. But he was on a big set that would just go around in circles while he was playing It Is You. So keeping up with the entertainment factor, I saw some times where they did it in the middle of a crowd. So he's kind of rotating where I guess more people could get a better view, and it was kind of set up. But I believe that's also in the music video that he is on a rotating platform. But that's another stunt that they did as far as production goes.
I thought that was a little bit later on, but...
Well, I remember they played It Is You during that song, I thought. Or at least during that song. I could be completely wrong. I mean, this is...
I don't remember that.
I guess...
You might be right, though. I don't know.
We'll have to look that up.
Anyway, 2003, April 8th, 2003, they released their first worship album. It's called Adoration, the worship album. How about that? And it's notable that Steve Taylor is still writing on these worship songs. There's also some notable names on this: Toby McKeon, Martin Smith, Stuart Townsend. Well, of course, Stuart Townsend.
Steve Taylor.
Because in Christ alone.
You know, in retrospect, maybe they did that platform on He Reigns, but It Is You is also on this album. So,
yeah, that's true. He Reigns is, again, it's another iconic Newsboys song that comes from this album. It was one of my favorite moments during that entire period of the Newsboys, when he would break it down at the very like near the bridge, all the powers of darkness part, and then the band comes back in. That was one of my favorite Newsboys moments.
Era is kind of the first time, at least that I remember, that Peter Furler started preaching, like in the middle. He was very well-spoken, very charismatic, and he would take time out in between songs, in the middle of songs, and I'm sure they were stuff he had written before, but he would just give such powerful little messages, and it wasn't like he took a 30-minute break in the middle of the set. He might take a break in the middle of a bridge or leading into a song, but he would give such inspirational messages right there, and that became kind of a staple of this decade, as far as I remember, that Peter Furler, he was going to talk, and it was worth listening to. I
remember also from this album, hearing Phil Joel sing "You Are My King" live was such a memorable moment for me. And again, Phil Joel has released a lot of worship stuff apart from the Newsboys. since this. And so I know that his heart was there and continued to be there after the Newsboys, after he left. So again, this is not something at least, especially from conversations with him, it's not something that they did for business reasons.
Yeah, and I wasn't accusing them of that. I was just kind of mentioning that as far as people think, oh, this is a worship album.
Yeah.
Go listen to it.
And that's not me knowing anything. That's just me, from sitting in the crowd. Yeah, so, Take My Hand's Praises is kind of like a redone song from their hits album. There's a couple live songs from Thrive on this album. Yeah, from this era, and we can even continue this with the next album. There's not a whole lot for me when it comes to listening to the studio stuff. A lot of my memories during this time is seeing them live. And I think a lot of times that's why, for me, live worship albums are a lot better.
That makes sense.
I don't know.
So
that might just be my preference. Unless it's like one of those Bethel Jesus Culture 15 minutes a song thing. Never mind. Anyway. Yeah, so not long after this album was released, Jody Davis left the band.
Oh, no.
Jody had some things going on with his family. Not really for us to get into. But he left the band, and a guy named Brian Olson took over for guitars. Now, I believe I remember, and I might be remembering this wrong, but when Jody went away, the way that they presented it was he was going to come back.
See, I don't remember that.
It wasn't a permanent thing.
What I remember is, what was the other guy's name you mentioned that replaced him?
Brian Olson.
Okay. What I remember is Paul Coleman.
Okay.
And
we'll get to that.
Yeah, I know, but that's this era kind of had some subtle changes as to before. I think Peter Furler is the only remnant of the original band at this point.
Yeah.
But
you have guys that have been there for
a while.
A decade at this point, at least.
And you even think of, Phil Joel's the new guy at this point, and how long has he been there? He's been there for at least 5 or 6 years at this point.
Yeah, since going public, pretty much.
Yeah, I don't remember much. Were you talking about Devotion?
Well, I was setting it up because in between Adoration and Devotion was when Jody left.
Okay. All right, continue.
And to kind of give a little background on Brian Olson, he was in a band called Vota, which was also known as Casting Pearls at some point, and then Casting Crowns came out, and he said, we better change our name to Vota, and then at some point he decided to join the Newsboys, or someone offered him a spot in the Newsboys, so he was a Newsboys for a little bit. And that does take us to Devotion. Came out in November 2nd, 2004. The album cover was shot by a guy named Jimmy Abegg in some spot in Tennessee. But it's some unique design to a bridge that they liked, and Jimmy Abegg's a phenomenal photographer, and so that's where that comes from. There's a lot more collaboration on this album than the last one. You have an appearance from Rebecca St. James on Blessed Be Your Name, which ended up being one of those songs that you talked about that Peter would he would just stop in the middle of the song and preach.
Yeah.
Like you said.
Now let the kids know who Rebecca St. James is.
Rebecca St. James, who just put out an album, by the way.
Brand new. Yes.
She was on Forefront Records in the mid to late 90s. And she ended up having more brothers that ended up becoming For King and Country.
Yeah, so For King and Country is directly related to the Newsboys. You heard it here.
So, Stu G from Delirious wrote a song on this album. John Ellis of Tree 63. There's a lot of collaborations on this. Tim Hughes writes a song with them. He was a pretty big worship writer. We still have Steve Taylor on this song, or this album. This album, for me, I don't remember a whole lot from it. I went back and listened to it, and there's I don't remember that much from it. Just, again, a lot of my memories from this era of the Newsboys were live. And
I remember specifically, this is going into my freshman year of high school. I remember this album coming out and me thinking, okay, this is the B-sides album. Like, that's not factual. That's just in my head. I was like, okay, they wrote a worship album. Maybe they wanted to keep going in that direction for a little bit, and they wrote another worship album. And then in my head, it was like, okay, let's get back to the Newsboys. Let's get back to Taking Me to Your Leader. Let's get back to Step Up to the Microphone. And then this album came out, and like you said, I didn't have very much time for it. Just this is when Demon Hunter was coming out and bands like that. And so Newsboys released another worship album. Okay, that's kind of cool. I didn't really have much time or appreciation for it, and I doubt I even really listened to it that much. So that's kind of where I am on that front as far as devotion goes. It felt like more of the same to me.
Yeah, and it was, for me, I really liked the title track, Devotion. And, their cover of Blessed Be Your Name was pretty good.
I believe they even put out like a worship collection after this.
Yeah.
So
I just, other than that, I don't remember a whole lot from this album, even going back and listening to it.
And that's not saying it's a bad album. You might go listen to it and really enjoy it. That's where I am. I'm letting you know.
I agree with you. As you mentioned, this was a time where they were kind of filling in for Jody. Brian Olsen left after Declaration was released and was replaced by Paul Coleman from the Paul Coleman Trio band.
Very, it's funny to go back through these histories, and I mean the Newsboys may be the biggest Christian band in the world today.
Yeah.
I mean I don't know the facts on that, but they're definitely top 5. But Paul Coleman was a newsboy, and that might not mean much to some people, but I know Paul Coleman was one of my dad's favorites. And the Paul Coleman Trio was a big deal. Delirious is no longer around. They were a big deal, and they were co-writing on this stuff. Rebecca St. James was a big deal.
Yeah.
So mentioning these names as far as, oh, this person played on this song, if you don't know who these people are, then it might not have the same impact as you thinking, oh, Paul Coleman of the Paul Coleman Trio, who did very well for themselves as far as notoriety. Now he's a newsboy, so I just remember that being kind of a big deal.
It was a big deal. I don't know if the album sales from the Devotion album was what they wanted. I don't know. But for whatever reason, they thought, you know what? We're going to kind of go back and do what we know what to do. We're just going to do what we're good at.
I think it had kind of run its course, and not ever that worshiping God can kind of run its course. But as we mentioned at the beginning, where some of the albums seem to be kind of business decisions, this of course is me just speculating. I felt like Devotion was kind of, like I said, it was kind of a B-sides. We've released a few worship albums. We have some of these worship songs left that we've written. We might as well get them out there. The next album, which you're about to mention, I feel like they're like, okay, we had a phase, a good phase, which created a lot of good music, but we're back.
Yes, and that album is called Go. And that came out on Halloween, October 31st, 2006. And this album is more of a return to the old Newsboys sound that we all kind of loved with Step Up to the Microphone and Thrive.
Wherever We Go was such a breath of fresh air.
Oh, yeah.
After, 4 albums?
It had been a while.
It had been a while before, because in my head and heart, the Newsboys were done. The John James era, which is my personal favorite era, had ended. They had moved in this direction. And then the return, just hearing Wherever We Go as the first track on that, it's just, and then Something Beautiful is still a song that they played live to this day. That this album was, it's good. It's, as far as Newsboys go, I feel like it's an underrated album.
I agree with you.
Your Love is Better Than Life. Oh my gosh.
So good. Yes. And you know what? They still kind of did some worship on this. They didn't abandon it.
No.
I Am Free. They did a cover of that from the Desperation Band. And, you know, that was awesome. Something Beautiful for me is such a good song, man. I mean, that's one of the most beautiful songs that they've written.
And Something Beautiful stands out to me as a live song.
Yeah.
And when they're playing it, Something Beautiful is a great song. And then they have a part at the end in the song. If you listen to the recording, it's very good. And it has like kind of a concise ending. In their live set, I don't know if they still do this today, but they would play that part.
Yeah.
And then they would play it over with the intensity cranked up. And then they would play it over and the lights would be going crazy. And they would just keep building and building and building. And drums were going nuts. And I just remember very specifically at one concert thinking like, wow, they took this song from a really good song. And just with that kind of finale where they added just a little bit of an instrumental there at the end, they kind of they took it up a level. So Something Beautiful, that's what I'm going to remember it for. It's just Duncan Phillips going nuts on the drum set during a strobe light show.
You know, and this album also has another long form video. I believe it was called We Are Go. And it's another live album. And I think this is where you remember where there's that drum thing in the middle. This tour.
Which one?
This was when Peter was out in the crowd with that drum platform.
I was talking about a different platform.
Okay.
This was this was probably like a 15 by 15 circle that he would walk out on, and he would be on the front of it, and it would just spin in a circle, and he would, everyone in the crowd could see him at some point because he was going rotationally.
Okay.
The one that you're talking about, I remember he called it like his Walmart knockoff drum set, where he had a kick drum and a snare drum.
Yeah.
And some of the stuff that he could do on this little kid's toy set, just standing out in the crowd. Him and Duncan had a drum battle.
Yep.
And it would start, one would play a drum solo, and the other one would play a drum solo. And then Peter played a drum solo, and his platform rose high, like 30 feet in the air.
Yes.
Very high, very scary. And then Duncan's drum set would rise, and then they would battle back and forth, and finally Duncan would spin his drum set around upside down, and Peter Furler would start playing with him, and that was quite the show.
Indeed, and this album was really successful. It sold over 100,000 copies in their first 2 months, and that was one of the more successful releases of the decade for them.
They also had a bonus version of this where they had 3 additional songs And
Right.
I Am Free live version was one of those songs.
Yep. And then there was a song called City to City that ended up on a greatest hits album later. So this is where we have to say goodbye to another newsboy. Phil Joel, not long after this album, left the band. In fact, by the time they released the live album, he was gone. So
I remember this as far as when he left. That was almost as big of a deal as John James. Not as big of a deal as John James leaving, because John James was the front man.
yeah,
But
it's a big deal.
he sang a lot.
Yep.
And like, you even think about Entertaining Angels, which I feel like is kind of his first big fingerprints.
Yeah.
But his voice was synonymous with the Newsboys, and you always expected him to have a part or a verse or whatever the case may be. But I feel like it was a big loss for them as far as musical talent.
So, like I said, they had a greatest hits album they put out in 2007. There's a new track on there called Stay Strong that I think is one of their strongest songs of the decade. That kind of got lost. Their live album, like I mentioned, came out in 2008. It was recorded in 2007, but it didn't come out to 2008. And by that time, they were a 4-piece band. And yeah, I mean that was, and I think you can still go back and listen to that on like anywhere you want to stream music. They have I don't know what it's called. We Are Go. If you want to go check it out, there's a spot in here. I was going to talk about that on the first episode, but there's a spot on here where they had this kind of throwback B stage where they do some older stuff, and they did like I'm Not Ashamed and Reality, Love Liberty Disco, You're My King, and there's a spot somewhere at some point that a show that I was at where they were in the middle of that, and I yelled out Kingdom Man, and you can see Peter cracking up.
I remember that, yeah.
That was from this era. Kingdom Man was on an album that we talked about on the last episode. But anyway, yeah, this was a fun tour. You can go probably watch it on YouTube as well. It's kind of weird to watch because it's not shot in HD. And this was kind of like near the end of... I think HD was already a thing. So quality-wise, it's kind of grainy, but it's still pretty fun to go back and watch.
I remember Scrubs is a TV show that was going on in this era.
Okay.
And I've been listening to the Scrubs podcast, a brand new watch-along podcast, and they talked about they were one of the last shows to shoot on film instead of digital, and there's no HD version of that show. And they talked about how like you had to switch out actual film rolls, and it wasn't like, oh, I can save this and send a file via email. We had film rolls. So that's kind of cool that you can see the Newsboys kind of paralleling the technology that was going on in those days. But just as you mentioned, maybe off on a little tangent there. But
So that takes us to 2009. So at some point in 2009, the band announces Jody Davis is back.
back, baby.
And so he tells this story that I've heard that either right before he gets on the plane to meet the band or right after he gets off the plane to meet the band, he gets a call saying, hey, Peter Furler's done.
Yeah. That was another earth-shattering thing. Peter Furler's done.
I can't remember if this happened before or after the release of In the Hands of God. I want to say it was a little before.
But Phil Joel,
Because I remember, I want to say I remember when this came out, and I knew it was his last album.
but Phil Joel was on In the Hands of God, but he had just left.
He was gone.
Peter Furler, rumored to be leaving after this album, after this recording. Paul Coleman, who in my head is the logical person. So if it's not Peter Furler, it's Phil Joel. Well, shoot, Phil Joel's gone. What about Paul Coleman as the next logical guy to step in and sing? And he's gone.
He's gone.
So this
So
was the last Newsboys album as far as I was concerned, because what are they going to do? There's the original band member, the only one that had been there since 1985, had been there for so long. He was leaving the band, and it wasn't necessarily anything like ill-willed from what I've heard. It was just he kind of wanted to not be traveling so much all the time. He kind of wanted to do his own thing, do some producing, do some writing, do some speaking, and he decided that this was going to be his last album.
So anyway, regardless of this happened, regardless if they announced this before or after, this was the last album that we know of that Peter Furler was the lead guy for the Newsboys. And we know now in hindsight, this is probably also the last album for a while anyway, that Steve Taylor was involved. The band would begin to look a lot different creatively, and we're not going to talk about that for this because that's another decade.
We can maybe tease it.
Yeah. Anyway, not long after this, the Newsboys announced that Michael Tate was taking over. Michael Tate actually sang background vocals also on In the Hands of God, along with Phil Joel. And not long after that, they released a version of Glorious from In the Hands of God, where Michael Tate actually sings the lead vocals, and that was actually the first song that Michael Tate was on a Newsboys song as the lead vocalist. So looking back on this album, there's a lot of tracks on here that I like. There's a couple songs like My Friend Jesus and The Upside that I just kind of scratched my head and I was like, don't really get this. Just still don't really hold up very well for me.
But in the Hands of God is definitely the one that stands out the most as far as this album goes.
My favorite song off this album was No Grave. I just thought that was a really good song. So that takes us to the end of the decade. Peter Furler is gone. Wonder what's going to happen to the band.
We may discuss that in a future episode.
And going into 2010, the band's got a new lead vocalist, Michael Tate.
From Tate and DC Talk fame.
Yes. And, yep, we'll see how that goes. Anyway, looking back on this decade, for me, I don't remember this decade as fondly as the 90s. What I remember from this decade was, I've said this many times, was their live show was still so electric. And
their live show is very powerful.
It was.
And I would liken it to, I've already mentioned Dave Crowder. Dave Crowder on a recording is not Dave Crowder live.
Yeah.
Chris Tomlin on a recording is not Chris Tomlin live. And some of these albums that the Newsboys put out, if you do not see them live in this era, then
it falls a little flat.
Maybe a completely forgotten decade for you.
I would agree. I think one of the things that encourages me is we saw a little turmoil with the band near the end of the 90s with John James leaving, some band changes with Phil leaving, Jody taking a hiatus, but they still found a way to make it work. And they're still around today. And
it's funny to think that Michael Tate is the new guy. In my head, he's the new guy, and he's been there for 10 years.
Over 10 years. It's hard to believe.
And maybe that's all anybody listening to this episode knows is the Michael Tate Newsboys.
Yeah.
So,
I mean, he's been the lead vocalist almost as long as Peter Furler was.
probably longer than John James. No, John James was 12 years?
85 to 98.
Okay. I was thinking they put out an album in 89 or whatever, 88. Yeah. So I was just thinking from album to album.
So, that's the end of the 2000s. Ranking these albums.
I think there's only 5, isn't there?
Is there only 5?
I mean, they had some bonus albums and some live albums and some stuff like that, but I feel like...
yeah, you're right.
Yeah, 5 total albums.
So, so number 5, just heading right into it, I'm going to say Devotion is number 5, simply because it's the least memorable for me.
I will agree. Devotion, like I said, their worship album arc kind of felt played out at that point. And I did not give this maybe as much time as it deserved. I don't even know. But it was not something that I was regularly listening to.
Adoration for me is number 4. There's some more memorable tracks on here. It's kind of a small album for me, though, because some of the tracks were live songs from the previous album. It's still not really in my wheelhouse when it comes to genre. So for that reason, it's number 4.
I'm going to put In the Hands of God as my number 4.
Okay.
Because I feel like In the Hands of God is the only song that I know off that album. And then I guess I'll just roll into number 3. My reason for my number 3 being Adoration is just because I remember that album more than I remember In the Hands of God. I remember the title track off of one album. I remember the complete album, which, as far as worship album goes, is a very good album, Adoration.
In the Hands of God is my number 3. So that takes us to our top 2. And I will say that number 2 for me is Thrive. I think that this album, for me, one of the things that makes it so high was the return to kind of the step up to the microphone feel. And
Steve Taylor was back.
You could tell that, especially on some of the deep cuts. And at the same time, it was a good mix of some of the worship that was memorable for me, like It Is You.
I'm going to disagree with you just for the fact that I had my number 2 and 1 the same as yours. But my number 2 is going to be Go, because I just want to be different than you. But this is such a good album.
It is.
It is such a good album. So, dang it. I'm gonna agree with you, even though it hurts me to say it. Thrive is number 2.
Yeah.
Million Pieces, like you said, as good as that song was played every 15 minutes on the radio. The music video was played. That song was absolutely
to death.
Killed.
Yep.
And because it's that good of a song, and if you go listen to it now, you're like bopping your head, and it's catchy, and you remember all the words, but that's also because you heard it so many times. John Woo on that is also kind of a little favorite for mine, but number 2 is going to be Thrive.
Yep, and Go is my number 1. I absolutely love this album. It's, for me, the last great Peter Furler Newsboys album. Jesus Freak Out gave it 4.5 stars. I don't know if I said that. But Your Love Is Better Than Life is kind of like a throwback to even like Boys Will Be Boys almost a little bit.
It had like a little hip-hop feel to it, I guess.
And, even some of the deep cuts like Secret Kingdom and Gonna Be Alright, The Letter,
I Am Free
are really good. Yeah, I Am Free is one of their iconic worship songs. Something beautiful for me was my favorite, probably my favorite Newsboys song from this decade. It's such a great song.
Yes, I agree.
Well, that takes us to the end of the decade. Man, we talked about 2 decades of the Newsboys.
And have not yet talked about Michael Tate.
Yeah, that's crazy. Guys, patreon.com/Decent Christian Talk. We're going to be talking about Take Me to Your Leader. It's going to be fun. We're going to talk about Down Under the Big Top.
Okay, so something that we've not done. So from our last 2 episodes, we ranked a top 5.
Yep.
Do you think you could make a top 5 from these entire 2 decades?
I have a feeling that the only album from the 2000s that might make it into my list would be Go.
I kind of feel the same. I feel like the 90s era was the better era.
Right.
But that doesn't mean that the 2000 era was bad.
Yeah. I think Go is probably the only one that would touch the top 5. So I don't know if it would be worth our time to do that.
But there you go. But if you haven't listened to our first decade, the 90s, that kind of gives you an idea that maybe that's what we're fonder of, and you should go listen to that episode and listen to the 90s music. If you are more into the worship side of the Newsboys, then this episode is the one for you, and you should go listen to some of their albums from this decade that you maybe didn't know about because you've only known the Michael Tate 2010 and beyond.
Well, guys, it's been fun. If you know a Newsboys fan, make sure you recommend these last 2 shows for them. Check us out on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and YouTube. We have a Facebook discussion group that will be putting a poll up about this episode. What's your favorite album from the 2000s? I'm sure Josh will throw in his 2 cents.
Josh Balog, I called you out in the last episode. If you have not put out that new episode yet, or not episode, but
new countdown.
New countdown. Listen, Newsboys countdown. I'm waiting for it. And I'm going to disagree with you very much.
Hey guys, check us out on Twitter, DC Talk Act 2, and on Instagram, DC Talk Podcast. We are out of time, as Tony Schiavone would say. We will catch you next time.
Oh my gosh, Josiah's got a chair. Don't forget to tip your waiters and waitresses. Thanks.
Don't forget to tip your waiters and waitresses. Thanks.